To start with, my name is Raghavan. I'm a former Indian diplomat. I'm sure there's a biodata hanging around somewhere, but that's not relevant. Our man of the moment here is Tilak Devasher, an accomplished author. And even before we come to the book that we are discussing today, I want to mention to you that he's the author of 3 penetrating, clinical, and rigorous analysis of Pakistani politics, society, sociology, economics, and so on. I would strongly recommend the book. It's called Pakistan, Quoting the Abyss, I think. That's his first book on Pakistan. So what we are talking about now is the book that he's written, which is, in a way, a subset of various issues that he has talked about before. It's called the Pashtuns. I think we heard in the introduction, the Pashtuns have been actually at the cutting edge of geopolitics over centuries. They were both the actors and the victims of geopolitics during the Great Game. And I think in the later stages, there have been more victims than actors in many ways. We in India have actually forgotten, or largely forgotten, the Pashtun connection that we've had with India. I mean, besides the fact that the Maurya Empire was counted parts of Pashtun land as its own, we've had a number of other interactions with the Pashtuns. We, of course, have Pashtun dynasties rule over us. You know, you have the Khaljis and the Khiljis and Lodi and so on. We've also had, in fact, according to present estimates, we have something like 3 to 4 million, 3 to 3.5 million people of Pashtun origin living in India. And that figure, some people raise it to even 10 million. And there are about 22,000 people who actually claim to be Pashto speaking, according to the census in India. So we've had a large connection, and we know the Pashtun origin people in our society even today. I mean, Dr. Zakir Hussain, our president, was of that origin. And then you have, of course, Dilip Kumar, Madhubala in Bollywood, Shah Rukh Khan and Salman Khan. You have Irfan Pathan. You have the Pataudis. A whole range of people of Pashtun origin in India, whom we call Pathans. But largely in the popular mind today, Pashtun is associated with Afghanistan and Pashtun is associated with the Taliban. And we forget that there is a much larger Pashtun population actually in Pakistan than there is in Afghanistan. And I would say, subject to correction by Tilak, that far more Pashtuns are non-Taliban than Taliban. So with this background, I want to move to Tilak himself to explain why he wrote this book, what this book is about, and what is the geopolitical significance of studying the Pashtuns as a tribal entity in today's world, and the mistake we would make in not understanding them and not understanding the dynamics within the Pashtun region. Tilak.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Raghavan. This is my 4th book, as it was just mentioned, in which I talk about the Pashtun ethnic identity that straddles Afghanistan and Pakistan. Though you cannot discuss a people without discussing the countries in which they reside, but this book is neither about Afghanistan nor about Pakistan in the main, but it is about the Pashtuns. This is their story. In the book, I seek answers to questions like who are the Pashtuns, where did they come from, what are their social, cultural, and religious beliefs, what is Pashtunwali, what is its link with Islam. It then goes on to talk about a century of contact that the British have had with the Pashtuns. It talks about the Durand Line, the developments in Afghanistan, up to the Saur Revolution, the Soviet intervention, the Mujahideen, the Civil War, the rise to power of the Taliban in the 1990s. It then talks about the US intervention, the rise, the Taliban insurgency for 20 years, the Taliban back in power, and the incubation of the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State Khorasan province, and the dubious role that Pakistan has played in all these events. And finally, it looks at the strengths and weaknesses of the Pashtuns. And if the Pashtuns are ever to find peace and tranquility, they will have to find answers themselves for their predicament and not depend on others to do so for them. So Pashtunistan, what I've called the land of the Pashtuns, straddles an areas of 100,000 square miles and traditionally stretched from the Indus River to the Hindu Kush. Today, this land is partitioned between Afghanistan and Pakistan due to the British-era controversial Durand Line. As a result, the Pashtuns, which are perhaps the largest Muslim tribal population in the world, are without a state of their own. Despite this, Pashtuns have a lot of commonalities, a common ideology of descent, common religion, Pashtunwali, a common code, which makes it possible to see them as a single ethnic identity inhabiting a single piece of real estate. And that's why I focused on the people, the Pashtuns, rather than the countries. In fact, the view that the Pashtuns form one nation is best expressed by a Pashto phrase, which is Laro Bar Yo Afghan, which means the Afghans as in low at the lowlands of Pakistan and the highlands of Afghanistan are one nation. But who are the Pashtuns? There are two complications in this. First, Pashtun, Pakhtun, Afghan, Pathan, they've been used interchangeably, causing some amount of confusion. And the reason for this is that the Persian name for the Pashtuns was Afghan, and the label stuck. The British tried to make a distinction between Afghan and Pathan. The Afghans were those who were in closer influence of Persia and spoke Dari, whereas the Pathan had closer interaction with India and spoke Pashto. The northern tribes use the word Pakhtun for themselves. The southern tribes use Pashtun. But where did the Pashtuns come from? There's again a lot of no sort of consensus on this issue. The various hypotheses vary from a Semitic origin, that they were one of the lost tribes of Israel, to an Indo-Aryan inception. But while historians will keep debating this, Pashtuns themselves have a different conception of who they are. Pashtun genealogies were compiled, many of them, and the most famous was something called the Makhzan-e-Afghani, the history of the Afghans, which was compiled in India by Ne'matullah Haravi when he was commissioned by Jahangir in 1613. Now, according to these chronicles, the Pashtuns have a common ancestor, Qais bin Rashid, who went to Medina during the lifetime of the Prophet, was converted to Islam, came back and spread the faith. This is an article of faith by all Pashtuns. They consider their lineage to start from conversion to Islam and not anything that happened before it. In reality, however, Islam came to Afghanistan through the conquest of the Arab generals under the Rashidun Caliphates and the Umayyad dynasty, but it took about 3-4 centuries to spread because of the mountainous area of Pashtunistan. The Buddhist kingdom in Bamiyan and the Hindu Shahi kingdom of Kabul were holdouts against the Islamic influence for about 2 or 3 centuries. Now, why are the Pashtuns important? The question that Ambassador Raghavan asked. You see, understanding Pashtun history, Pashtun culture, Pashtun Wali, and two Pashtun forces, Pashtun extremism and Pashtun nationalism, and a potential combination is critical for peace and stability in this region. Violence and terrorism and instability in this region has radiated outward and will radiate even more outward. So you have to have the right prescription in case peace has ever come to this area. And therefore, an understanding of Afghan Pashtun history and culture is essential to establish peace in this region. So I'll hand you back now to Ambassador Raghavan.
A number of points that you raised, I want to pick on 2 or 3 of them. One is, of course, you've said that besides being the largest Muslim tribal population in the world, the Pashtuns are a people without a state of their own. I think there's another aspect which makes your book unique in a sense. It has been said, and you quoted somebody who said this at the beginning of the century, that there is no connected history of the Pathans in their own land, whether written by themselves or by any through the ages who passed by. I think that fact remains true even now, and that is why your book is a first in this, which makes it merit reading. Now, you know, I want to talk about a very, very interesting incident in your book. It's more than an incident, it's a phase of our history, where you've talked about Badshah Khan, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the divided Pashtuns after it was in British territory, the NWFP. When this whole business about whether or not they would join India and what their status would be. Now, it's a very peculiar situation in many ways that this intensely religious people with intense tribal consciousness spawned a secular movement. What is a secular movement which Khudai Khidmatkars represented, the Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's movement. And when this question of whether or not they would accede to India came about, NWFP was ruled by a Congress government and not by the Muslim League. And there were machinations on the part of the Muslim League, of course, on the part of Jinnah, and on the part of the British, more importantly. Can you describe what happened then and what impact it had on Pashtun consciousness as well during that period?
That's very, very interesting. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, you see, NWFP, Northwest Frontier Province, was a peculiar problem for the Congress, for the Muslim League, and for the British. For the Congress, it was critical because it showed that Congress was not merely a Hindu party, but was also representative of the largest Muslim province. 96% of the population of NWFP was Muslim. For the Muslim League, if, as they claimed, they were the spokesmen of Indian Muslims, then it was important that the Muslim League government should be there in NWFP, which it wasn't. In fact, they lost the 46 elections to the Khudai Khudmazgar's Congress government. For the British, it was as big a problem as it was for the Muslim League. The British whole idea or philosophy behind partition of India was into Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. Now, NWFP was a holdout because it was the largest, 96% Muslim population, but with the Congress. And the British feared that if the question of accession to India or Pakistan was given to the elected assembly, like it was in the case of all other assemblies in India, they will vote for accession to India. And the whole partition plan would then fail because there was supposed to be only Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. Lord Ismay, who was Mountbatten's chief of staff, in fact called it a bastard situation that the Muslim people of NWFP had actually voted for a Congress government. So then there were a lot of machinations on how to overturn the verdict, the electoral verdict of 1946 elections. And Mountbatten then came up with this idea of a referendum. Even though elections had been held in 46 and elected a Congress government and a Congress majority, they said, no, we must have a referendum to decide whether the people want to go with India or with Pakistan. For whatever reason, I will not go into that or judge it, the Congress agreed to this without consulting the Khudai Khidmatgars. Ghaffar Khan was in Delhi, and this was his greatest lament to Gandhiji and to others, that we were in Delhi, why did you not even consult us? And in fact, he accused Mahatma Gandhi that you have now thrown us to the wolves. He did not accept the idea of referendum without a third option of Pashtunistan. They said it cannot be India and Pakistan. There must be Pashtunistan, all the Pashtun areas getting together in one and voting for autonomy or independence or whatever. This the British refused to do, and Mountbatten threatened to resign, that if the referendum proposal of only between India and Pakistan was not accepted, he was quit, and partition was, and freedom was off the table. So one thing led to the other. The Khudai Khidmatgars boycotted it, and they became part of Pakistan. Now this is, and Gandhiji gave an assurance to Ghaffar Khan, which is the really touching thing. He said, if ever the Pashtuns are in trouble, India will come to your rescue. Then he was asked, what happens to your non-violence in that case? And he said, I am non-violent, the government of India is not non-violent. But that promise has not been kept. And Ghaffar Khan told Pyarelal, Gandhiji's biographer, who met him in 1965 in Kabul, that Gandhiji's promise is not kept and India owes us the debt. And I think Indira Gandhi was for one. She accepted the debt and apologized deeply for not having carried out that situation. So that's why, this history, a lot of people here don't know that how NWFP could actually have been a part of India.
Well, it's very difficult to imagine today how India is going to repay that debt. But at least a consciousness should be there. And it actually underlines the fact of a Pashtun consciousness over all other identities. In fact, you quote Badshah Khan's son when he was asked, are you a Pashtun, are you a Muslim, are you a Pakistani? And his answer was, you quoted it.
Yeah, he said, I'm a 4,000-year-old Pashtun, a 1,000-year-old Musliman, and a 40-year-old Pakistani. So for him, his key identity was ethnic. It was Pashtun. It was then being a Muslim and only then being a Pakistani. So that is how strong the ethnic consciousness among the Pashtuns is.
And that, of course, brings us to how the Pashtuns were divided in their own land, which is the Durand line. Again, you've said in the history, the Afghan Empire actually used to extend to the banks of the Indus. And it was Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Sikh Empire which expanded it and took over Peshawar and therefore divided Afghanistan and Pakistan across the Durand line. So you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, so that was the first big break in Ahmad Shah Durrani's empire when Ranjit Singh's forces captured Peshawar, which was the winter capital of the Pashtuns. They have not still reconciled to the loss of Peshawar. The British, 1893, had the Durand Line, which actually demarcated spheres of influence. It was not an international boundary. So right from all documents, British statements in Parliament, letters from Delhi to London and London to Delhi, clearly identified this as spheres of influence, and that the Amir of Afghanistan had not lost sovereignty of these areas. But when Pakistan was to be created, the British realized that they would have to strengthen Pakistan in case they were to use it, both against the Soviet Union and because of its proximity to the wells of power, which was the Middle East. So then they changed the formulation overnight from spheres of influence to an international boundary. And the Afghans protested that how can you do this? But the British were able to get their way. And the interesting thing is that in 1949, a Loya Jirga was held in Afghanistan, and they rescinded all treaties with British India, starting from the 1879 Treaty of Gandamak, the Durand Line Agreement, the 1905 Agreement, and the 1921 Indo-Afghan Treaty. So as far as the Afghans are concerned, till today, there is no border that Afghanistan has with Pakistan. It is undemarcated. And no Afghan government, starting from the Muzahiban, starting from Dawood, continuing with Dawood, with Karzai, with Rabbani, everybody, nobody, the Taliban themselves have not accepted the boundary between Pakistan and Afghanistan. In fact, the Taliban have even uprooted the fence and saying this issue is unresolved and you cannot divide brothers by this artificial line. And this is a huge worry for Pakistan because the Durand Line and the Pashtunistan issue is the biggest fault line in Pakistan. Pakistan is aware of the fact that this is an undemarcated border. Because as a stronger state, if I'm convinced that my border is here, I don't need a weaker state to acknowledge it. But Pakistan has pressed upon each government in Kabul, especially on the Taliban, that please accept the Durand Line, and no Afghan government has accepted the Durand Line. And especially the Taliban. Pakistan thought that the Taliban will run and accept the Durand Line because of what they had supported them for the last 20 years. But the Taliban leave aside everything else. They are Pashtun Afghan nationalists. They will do nothing that will harm their country. And accepting the Durand Line, they'll be thrown out by the people.
Of course, the other impact of the Durand Line, which you said again in your book, is the fact that having lost territory in the south, the Afghan empire expanded to the north. And that had its own tragedy because that meant that the homogeneity of the Afghan population was lost, and then you had the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Hazaras, which resulted later in this fratricidal war about who will rule Afghanistan and how. Of course, one can also, the what-ifs of history. What if the Sikh Empire had not encroached on Afghan land? You would then have had a Pashtun land of its own. And during partition, Pakistan would have been a much smaller state. And the whole history of POK would have been different. Would you like to
Absolutely. You see, when Ranjit Singh crossed the Indus in 1823, it was like crossing the Rubicon. Things would never be the same again in the subcontinent. It was a huge step, which is not really being talked about or recognized, that the entire geopolitics of the region from 1823 till now was totally changed. Because he, with his armies, were able to, the only people who have been succeeded and victorious against the Pashtuns were the Sikhs. And it is acknowledged by them even today. And he went and captured Peshawar. He lost to the British. The British took over Peshawar from him up to the Khyber Pass. And they, when they left, handed it over to Pakistan. So the entire geopolitics changed by that one move of Ranjit Singh from 1823 when he crossed the Indus and captured Peshawar. The history of this area would have been totally different. Totally different.
And now, since we don't have much time, let me come to the present day. I want to ask you about where the Pashtuns are today, how they, what the trends of you've talked about how a tribal organization of society has been completely destroyed by the radicalization and by the geopolitics. Now, you today have, firstly, of course, we need to recognize still very strongly that Pashtun and Taliban are not identities. The Taliban are only part of the Pashtun. But we now have 3 Pashtun movements in the region. You have, of course, the Afghan Taliban, you have the Pakistan Taliban, and you also have this movement called, what is it? PTM. PTM. What's called PTM, the relatively, non-violent, not relatively, non-violent movement. Now, how do you see the interaction of this, and how do you see the future of the Pashtuns in the context of where Pakistan and Afghanistan are, and of course the impact on us of all this?
Yeah. You see, that's very interesting, because since 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the Pashtuns have faced constant warfare for the last 40, 50 years. And the good fighters, they have fought also in the past, but this was different, because to fight against the Soviets, US, Saudi and Pakistan encouraged pan-Islamism or global jihad. So you had fighters coming in from the Middle East with a different view and practice of Islam. This is the Wahhabi Islam, whereas the Pashtuns have always had a Deobandi Islam with strong Sufi influences. So when these people came, they set up their own madrasas, they set up their own mosques, madrasas to teach refugee children, to make them into mujahideen, to go and fight against the Soviets. This in turn totally turned Pashtun society upside down. The traditional tribal maliks and khans who had held the Pashtun tribal sector, tribal scene for centuries and brought it stability was shattered. Instead of tribal maliks and khans, you had new leaders who were Islamists, both on the Afghanistan side and also on the Pakistani side. So the traditional values of Pashtuns, the stability of the region is totally destroyed. Now for the US, it was just a question of defeating the Soviets. They defeated the Soviets and they left. But the consequences had to be faced by the Pashtuns who were stayed back. So then you have the Afghan Taliban. You will not believe it, but they have a very strong Sufi influence. In Pashtunistan has been one of the most important centers of Sufi Islam. At one time, Herat was called Khak-e-Auliya, that is the dust of the Sufi saints. Ghazni was called the soil, or the abode of the Sufi saints. The most famous Sufi shrine in Pakistan, Dataganj, is actually a person born in Ghazni, Al-Hajwari, who is buried over there. So Sufism was very strong in Afghanistan, and it merged with Deobandi Islam to give it a conservative but relatively moderate Islam. This was totally shattered with the coming of the Middle East fighters. Then you have the Tabligh Jamaat and all kinds of things. So today, it gives us a sense of total amount of violence and breakdown of Pashtun society. Now to retrieve this is going to be an extraordinarily hard task, and will require commitment of both Afghanistan and Pakistan in case this is to be done. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which was just mentioned, is a Pakistan-based and Pakistan-focused group. It came into its own after the attack on the Lal Masjid during Musharraf's time in 2007, violently focused on Pakistan Army and the Pakistan government, and they began by wanting to establish Sharia in the federally administered tribal areas. Now they are moving to a more nationalistic response. They want demerger of FATA, and they want to have their own independent sort of a government in FATA. The Pashtun Tahaffuz movement is a civil rights movement who want that Pashtuns should not be used as cannon fodder for Pakistan's foreign policy, and they must enjoy the same rights and privileges as all the other nationalities, especially Punjabi, in Pakistan. So it is a potential. There is a potential that these three organizations, though different ideologies, but they are Pashtuns, all of them are Pashtuns, can come together. In fact, recently there was this Pashtun Qaumi Jirga. I won't go into details, but representatives of Pashtuns all over Pakistan and from Afghanistan. And they came with a consensus document that could become the blueprint of a Pashtun vision for how they see themselves in the future.
Thank you.